Hi, everybody. All you folks who have come in on time, thank you so much for joining us for the webinar from the Water Center. And we will get started in about 2 minutes. We're going to let some other people join the call. In case you want to know the science of this, I look at the number of participants at the bottom of my screen, and just like popcorn, when you don't see a change for 30 seconds, then you know that it's time for you to start. All right, very good. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Water Center's Water Exchange Speaker Series. I'm Howard Newkirk. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Center, and I'm also the chair of DRBC's Advisory Committee on Climate Change. The reason that's an important element of my background for today is that first, DRBC is a co-host of this panel, and all the panelists are involved in one fashion or another with the Advisory Committee on Climate Change. The Water Center is an applied research institute, and we're working on integrating this concept of one water strategies, and we're looking to do that within a community's social, economic, and environmental priorities. Our overall research goal is to improve our natural and man-made water systems with a focus on community, equity, science, resilience, and justice. Next slide, please. In much of our work, we focus on answering this one key question. How do we adapt, plan, and implement water laws, regulations, policies, and water systems best practices that serve to protect public health and the environment, while also encouraging wide-ranging local benefits, economic growth, and resilient communities that are sustainable, equitable, and just? That sounds like a pretty simple task, but that's what we're up for. And I think many of you on the line here probably are looking at what our future holds, and putting this together with a statement like that is hopefully helpful to everyone here. We offer a series of programs and publications and welcome anyone interested in urban water issues to learn, grow, and collaborate with us through projects, research, and through our programming. Next slide, please. And again, delighted to be co-hosting this webinar with our good friends at the Delaware River Basin Commission. And Delaware River Basin Commission is a regional interstate water resources agency that was created in 1961 when President Kennedy and the governors of Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York all signed at the same time in the same place a unique law unifying a unified approach to managing an entire river system without regard to political boundaries. That's just over 60 years ago. It's still holding strong. The DRBC gets involved in so many of the issues with the Delaware River and Delaware River watershed, and thank you guys for being there. And I love this slide, and clearly I stole it from DRBC, but it really shows the complexity of integrating and forecasting all parts of climate change, environment, and planning today for what the future may hold, despite the uncertainties. And these uncertainties, for every one of those little circles, some are more certain than others, but they all hold some vagaries into our future, and all those uncertainties all build upon each other. And the question that I ask, and I'm hoping that we're coming to an answer, but perhaps our panelists will be able to answer, is whether we design for climate change, or do we merely design with climate change in mind? And what's the right approach today when we don't really know the full impact of what's coming? Next slide, please. So we have a great set of panelists with us today to discuss the current state of climate change planning and adaptation from their perspectives of the federal, regional, and municipal levels. Our panelists are Amanda Babson from the National Park Service, Beth Brown from Delaware River Basin Commission, and Julia Rockwell from Philadelphia Water. The flow of events today is Amanda, Beth, and Julia will each provide a 10-minute presentation. This will be followed by a panel discussion, which will be open to the audience, Q&A. So we really want to hear your questions. So please send your questions into the Q&A icon, not the chat icon, but the Q&A icon on your screen. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Lastly, and before we start, I want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website and social media for anyone who is not able to join us today. So let me introduce our panelists, all of whom are closely connected to the Delaware River Basin Commission Advisory Committee on Climate Change. Our first speaker will be Amanda Babson, who is the Coastal Landscape Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service's North Atlantic Appalachian region. Isn't that great to know that the National Park Service has a Coastal Landscape Adaptation Coordinator? I mean, it makes me feel good. She led science and natural and cultural resource management efforts related to climate change adaptation. She leads those, and she holds a PhD in oceanography from the University of Washington. Beth Brown, our second speaker, is the Director of External Affairs and Communications for the Delaware River Basin Commission. She is responsible for developing, maintaining, and leveraging DRBC relationships with key stakeholders. Before joining DRBC, Beth led the National Audubon Society's Delaware River Watershed Program, driving its significant growth and impact. Beth holds a BS in biology from Muhlenberg College and a law degree from the George Washington University Law School. Last but not least is my good friend and colleague, Julia Rockwell, who is the Climate Change Adaptation Program Manager at Philadelphia Water. She is a water resources management professional with over a decade of experience. A primary focus of Julia's current work is to mainstream the use of actionable climate change science in planning, design, and decision-making. Julia holds a bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering from Bucknell and a master's of environmental management from Duke University. Thank you all for being a part of this program. And I will now turn this over to Amanda, who will make her presentation, followed by Beth and then Julia. Amanda. You're on mute.
I thought Beth was going to go first. Beth, are you going first? Sorry about that.
I don't know. Either way.
I'm happy to go first. Sure.
For the audience, we had a whole discussion of whether we should go from federal government to regional to local, and I guess we didn't make the final decision on that. So thank you, Beth.
All right, great. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Beth Brown. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of External Affairs and Communications at the Delaware River Basin Commission. Thank you, Howard and the Water Center, for having AC3 and the Delaware River Basin Commission today. I feel like we're really going to highlight the breadth and depth of knowledge that the committee represents. Howard gave a nice introduction to the Delaware River Basin Commission and who we are, but I'll just add to that a little bit more more detail, we are 4 states and the federal government. Our commissioners are the governors of our member states, and the federal government is represented by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Our staff consists of planners, engineers, and scientists primarily. And why is the DRBC needed? When DRBC was created in the 60s, there were a multiplicity of powers, agencies, duties within the watershed, a little bit chaotic. And as Howard mentioned, there was a coming together in 1961 to form the commission. The Delaware River is 330 miles, and the watershed is relatively small compared to other major rivers, but we have a high size to service ratio. That means that 5% of the US population lives in the basin, and 13.3 million people rely on our water. This number is high in part because of a 1954 Supreme Court decree that allows New York City to provide drinking water from the basin to today about half of its residents. And our commission programs today include water quality monitoring and assessment, supply allocation, regulatory review and permitting, water conservation initiatives and planning, drought management, flood loss reduction. And we've been managing water quality and quantity in the Delaware River Basin since 1961. We look at our work in 4 areas of water security for our stakeholders, those 13.3 million people. We think about these in 4 quadrants of water quality, availability, resiliency, and equity. And the DRBC was created before climate change was widely understood, but today there's consensus that it is impacting water availability, quality, and the ability to meet water management goals in our basin as well as across the country and the world. And so climate considerations influence our work across all 4 of those quadrants of our water security model. We're identifying and prioritizing threats and estimating future conditions, as well as recommendations for mitigation, adaptation, and improved resiliency in the basin. Taking 3 areas that we're focused on, the first is sea level rise. The threat here is greatest during the droughts, but saltwater intrusion has wide-ranging impacts. Everything from drinking water, power generation, agriculture, and other industries in our basin, and ecosystems like changing oyster habitat and marsh structure. More frequent droughts and flood conditions and ways that flooding shows up differently, like sunny day or high tide flooding, is a major concern. The basin has experienced more severe droughts and floods than those seen in the past 50 years, and our predictions are that more severe wet and dry flows are likely. And finally, we're very focused on adequate freshwater storage. DRBC's goals during droughts are to preserve regional storage for water supply, flow augmentation, and salinity control, but changed snowpack and snowmelt, as well as changed weather patterns, has a major impact on storage and our ability to meet flow objectives and flow requirements. Climate change undoubtedly has a role in other areas in terms of water quality and temperature, but these are some of the major issues we'll focus on today. And I'd like to just take a minute to talk about what DRBC is already at work on when it comes to climate. So the effects of climate change are being considered as the Basin Commission plans for future water supply availability and whether new drought or flow management programs are needed in the basin. Modeling and other analyses are underway to further define the range of risks due to climate change, as well as evaluating future water demands for a variety of purposes. And once this work is complete, different approaches and mitigation measures will be needed to develop robust plans and resources to address the risks posed by climate change. In terms of sea level rise, during the 1960s, the salt front, or where salty water meets fresh water, reached River Mile 100. And because of DRBC's drought management plans and water code regulations, we've been able to hold the the salt front at or below river mile 92. As you can see in the graphic, the Philadelphia region and drinking water intakes surrounding that are highly vulnerable, and new planning efforts are needed to incorporate sea level rise to protect drinking water intakes and other vulnerabilities. So our staff uses 3D modeling to consider sea level rise on drought management, and we're developing identification of salt front locations under a variety of sea level rise scenarios so that we can implement those in our flow management model. Modeling is also being used to understand spatial changes in salinity relative to key aquatic habitat areas. And we also use hydrologic modeling to predict future water availability. In other words, how do temperature and precipitation changes change future conditions for flow and water availability? Our initial analysis is telling us that flows will modestly increase over time, but that there's a high amount of seasonality changes, and with less snow, we'll get less snowmelt that has a direct impact on flow, but that increased evapotranspiration may offset some of this increased precipitation that we'll experience. We're also analyzing past water use and projected future water use demands across key sectors and evaluating those against our estimated water supply. We reported our results just a few months ago on this particular initiative, and on our website there's a really cool interactive data resource that allows you to look by subwatershed at the Huck 8 level and by sector to see how water use may change. Some of the key takeaways were that consumptive use overall was projected to remain relatively stable, but that there would be a significantly high spatial variation in terms of both water withdrawals and consumptive use. And so we'll have to think about that in terms of temporal and seasonal variation relative to availability, and certainly plug that into our decision making at the Commission. Thermoelectric consumptive use, as one example, was constant despite decreasing withdrawals after changes in technology. So there's just a lot of interesting change in our region in terms of what industry and how people are using water, and that will continue to be the case. And this study projected out to the year 2060. We've also just begun a study of freshwater storage options. We're exploring the feasibility of additional freshwater storage to meet future water availability, climate adaptation, and drought management needs. And that study is ongoing. And of course, our advisory committee on climate change. DRBC formed the committee in 2020 to provide the Commission and the Basin community with scientifically based information to identify and prioritize threats to the Basin's water resources and to provide recommendations. These include mitigation, adaptation, as well as policy recommendations. We're also ramping up and taking climate into consideration in our outreach work. One example I'll give is in capacity building. Starting in the Upper Basin, the Commission has been partnering with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency to offer workshops and resources for local governments to tap into FEMA programs like BRIC and hazard mitigation for funding. And these resources are being underutilized in the Upper Basin, and so bridging the gap is helping connect local governments with knowledge and resources to adapt and prepare for flood and other hazard issues. Climate change will affect certain groups more than others, particularly vulnerable, poor, young, old, and cities are uniquely sensitive to many impacts, especially extreme weather impacts. And studies are also showing that relative investment in our basin are unevenly distributed. So when we talk about water equity, what do we mean and what can we do? At a global scale, groups like the IPCC consider how water management and efficiency line up with UN Sustainable Development Goals and give positive marks to responsible water management and efficiency. But what does that mean at the basin scale? DRBC's water security model for equity encompasses issues like access, water quality, environmental justice, workforce, affordability, and other considerations. Right now, DRBC is tracking our member states and federal entities' work on environmental justice. For example, how the Justice 40 initiative is being implemented in things like the bipartisan infrastructure law that is also providing funding for water-related projects in our basin. New Jersey has been a leader with a new definition of overburdened communities under its environmental justice law and enhanced participation in permitting. And in Pennsylvania, the DEP is currently updating its public participation process. In fact, its comment period on that proposal ends today, so you can still make your voice heard on that. Working on our own, we're devising a strategic plan for DEIJ. This has both internal and external components. Some of the key elements are an amended vision, mission, and value statement incorporating DEIJ principles into the Delaware River Basin Commission's overall vision, mission, and values, and we've accomplished that just last month. We're also looking to plan and implement steps towards building relationships with underserved communities, making recommendations, and understanding how to ensure environmental justice in rulemaking and project review at the Commission. And we recognize the need not only for technological input on our work, but also community input on our work. In our most recent rulemaking on import and exportation of water, we piloted expanding access through communications products, hearing enhancements, and direct outreach to hear from more members of our basin community on our proposed rulemaking. Additionally, through a campaign called Our Shared Waters, we get to spend time on the ground at community events and build partnerships with organizations working in diverse communities, giving us the privilege of listening and learning directly from community members and leaders. I'll also add that from its inception, the AC3 has recognized DEIJ as an important component of the climate change conversation and has begun to provide the Commission with input on priorities, helping us identify issues to inform the development of a climate change policy. And I'll wrap up with looking ahead to our future work. Considering issues from the last slide, as I said, we are in the middle, but we have work ahead to finish and implement recommendations from our strategic planning process. We'll continue to work to identify science-based future scenarios for the basin, including some of those modeling and planning studies, as well as recognizing that there's a need for a comprehensive basin-wide climate impact study and flood study. We're working with the committee to have a climate forum in 2023, and this is very exciting, and I'm happy to share that we'll be tucked into the Partnership for the Delaware Estuaries Science and Environmental Summit starting January 29th, 2023, which will take place in person at Harrah's Atlantic City. And so if anyone listening wants to become a sponsor or attend, look out for information to come out on that very soon. Finally, I just want to briefly reflect on my time as an AC3 committee member. As Howard mentioned, I was previously with the National Audubon Society in their Mid-Atlantic office, heading up the watershed program there. And Audubon put out a key study linking climate change with major bird population declines. And it was such an honor to be able to localize that work in the Delaware Basin through serving on the committee, and just providing the opportunity to provide that perspective as well as hear from other experts was fantastic. So I'm thrilled to now be at the commission and keep up with the work that the committee is doing. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Beth, and we'll get back to you with some questions. But we're going to move now to Amanda. Good to go?
Thanks so much, Beth. I think that was great to start off with a focus on the Delaware River Basin, and I'm happy now to sorry, is that in slideshow mode?
Not yet.
Not yet. How's that?
Good.
Okay, thanks. And I'm now happy to share the federal perspective on some of the National Park Service climate adaptation frameworks and guidance that we have that we've been developing and using, and some of which may be applicable to our partners in the basin. So I'll be sharing a variety of some of the available tools and guidance that we have, some of which we have published documents, and then an example from within the basin at the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area of how the type of application of these frameworks. So the Park Service has a guidance document published last year called Planning for a Changing Climate. This builds on the Climate Smart Conservation Guidance, which was a natural resource focused effort, and this applies Park Service wide. And a couple of the big concepts within that are to develop forward-looking goals that consider future climate conditions, and to consider more than one scenario of the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about scenario planning. In this adaptive planning cycle that the figure is here from, there are 4 steps have that darker circle around those. And all of those are ones that are well suited to looking at more than one scenario as we do that. I'll also highlight step 2 is assess climate vulnerabilities and risks. And that's something that we've done a fair bit of. And I'll share examples of that now. So the Park Service has been developing and applying a wide variety of vulnerability assessments, and it is varied based on what a particular park needed, or focusing on a resource type, or as opportunities arose where a partner might have been doing a vulnerability assessment that a park fell between. But we have focused a lot on coastal efforts, and one of the things was partners at Western Carolina University had developed a protocol on coastal facilities vulnerability assessments. And we're now implementing that, have done it at over 50 parks, and are implementing it to do it consistently so that we can compare between parks and use that in our planning to be consistent across parks. And another effort we've done is integrated coastal facility vulnerability, integrated coastal vulnerability assessment. So that's looking across facilities, natural resources, and cultural resources. So you can look park-wide and do your planning across different types of resources, and make sure that the adaptation plans you're doing for one also take into consideration the impacts on the others. And the facility component of that builds on that facility vulnerability assessment. So one park we did that for was Fire Island National Seashore, which the figure here shows the results of. So it looks at different resources types and scores them on a high, moderate, low. And the park has since used that assessment to do things like identify red flags. So came up issues of contamination of ponds that they're now working on addressing because that future vulnerability. And they had a Bay Shoreline Management Workshop last year because the vulnerability assessment identified that while a lot of the erosion concerns had focused on the ocean side, but bay side erosion is an issue. And so out of that workshop, now it's leading to design of some nature-based solutions that hopefully will be implemented. I mentioned scenarios and scenario planning. This has been an important planning tool we've used. The idea is that because there's so much uncertainty within climate change, traditional planning approaches where we try to, for instance, forecast the most likely future aren't well suited to our planning needs under future climate. And we want to be able to look at a range of plausible futures and then have the planning flexibility to adjust if it turns out when we're monitoring and it turns out we're not going in one direction, we're going in a different direction. be prepared for that range of plausible futures. So one park where we've done this is Acadia National Park. And the figure here shows that the idea of you have a range of different temperature and precipitation, sea level rise and storms, drivers, and then they came up with 4 different scenarios that were a combination of those, as well as other factors where there's high uncertainty. And then they use these to inform decisions on infrastructure, staffing, and ecosystem management. And they're already implementing these things as they have some of those extreme storm events and have to figure out how their emergency response plans or their post storm restoration, how they prioritize those, thinking about how those future scenarios may play out. And it's been an important tool also for engagement with community members. So this is the example of those 4 scenarios of the storylines that went with them. So for instance, the bigger boat, you have warming continued at a similar pace, but the precipitation ends up being at the high end of the projections, and you're having frequent storms and major flooding events. Versus a sizzling summer, flood, and fall, there's hot summers, there's mild winters, along with that goes episodic summer droughts, as well as some fall storms. And how does that differ in terms of your planning processes? So they've been a leader in implementing that. And another framework that they've been using, that the Park Service has been part of the group that's been developing, is the RAD framework, resist, accept, direct. And this is designed around natural resources, recognizing that there are some, when you're doing those steps of the planning for change in climate cycle, where you're identifying and choosing your adaptation strategies, there's some cases where you may be resisting change and trying to keep things the way they were as long as possible, or restore to some previous condition. But there are other cases where you have to accept change, where we can't keep things they were everywhere. And so we may allow those ecosystems to respond to how the climate is driving them. But there are other cases where you may want to actively direct to a desired future condition, where you're recognizing you can't keep things the way they were, but if you would lose valued, important community or park values that are essential. So you may direct to a different future condition. So this is an important tool that I think wanted people to be aware of. And another one with the Park Service has been a real leader on is on cultural resources adaptation. And we have policy guidance that directs us to not just look at vulnerability, but to prioritize based on a combination of vulnerability and significance. When we can't protect everything, need to make sure we have ways of understanding the significance. And we have a cultural resources climate change strategy that builds on that and several other key concepts. In terms of implementing that, we have partners at North Carolina State University who developed a framework for historical buildings that they piloted at Cape Lookout National Seashore within a couple historic districts. So there were a lot of different historic buildings, and they had different degrees of vulnerability and different significance. And how do you optimize your strategies for what you do for each of those different buildings to try and maintain the most significance and reduce the vulnerability? Those same partners are building on that and looking at transferring that to archaeological sites, where there, as you can imagine, there's different challenges, both to understand vulnerability, but in particular significance. And for significance, we're recognizing that we need to make sure we're incorporating tribal perspectives and those of traditionally associated people when we're prioritizing significance of different sites. I'm going to wrap up by highlighting an example within the Delaware River Basin, because I recognize that a lot of the work that we've been doing, that I've been highlighting, that I've been leading, has been focused on coastal, but we do have efforts for river parks that have been part of their, while some of these frameworks weren't and tools weren't necessarily published by the time for this project, projects like this have been contributed to and developing the ideas that are now being part of our guidance. So within Delaware Water Gap, there's at Van Campen's Brook, there's a wetland restoration at the Watergate Recreation Site, where they are removing artificial dams and human-made ponds. And as part of this restoration, they are doing that, incorporate future scenarios and forward-looking goals that incorporate climate information. And so for these, they included future precipitation and evapotranspirations into their groundwater modeling to make sure that the wetlands design could meet those goals, for instance, around cold water fisheries and making sure that under future climate conditions, they would still be able to meet those. And they use multiple scenarios, both in terms of the emission scenarios, because we don't know which way we're going to go in terms of how much warming there will be, but also given the uncertainty in precipitation, they included under dry, normal, and wet years. So to make sure it's a robust plan so that continue to meet those goals under the future. I would say, as I mentioned, the RAD framework didn't exist at the time of this design, but I think it's a great example of how we're not just trying to resist change. There's a combination of approaches in this design, restoration design, that includes some strategies that are resisting, but others that are directing towards a different future to be prepared for that. So thanks for including me, and I will pass it off to Julia.
Great, thank you, Amanda and Beth, for your presentations, and thanks to Howard and the Water Center for hosting this panel. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I think I'm showing the slide preview setting, which I'm going to try and switch here. Okay, are you seeing the full slide now? Hope so. So my name is Julia Rockwell, and I manage the Climate Change Adaptation Program at the Philadelphia Water Department. And if you have seen any of our presentations in the past, you have most likely seen this slide, but it does provide a really good overview of the scope of services that we provide at PWD. So we are what is known as a one water utility, meaning we provide drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services to the city of Philadelphia. And I'm not going to go through all of the different infrastructure components and systems listed on this slide, but a few main highlights are that we get our drinking water from the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. We have 3 major drinking water treatment plants, 3 major water pollution control plants, thousands of miles each of water and sewer mains. And then we also have a comprehensive green stormwater infrastructure program to reduce our combined sewer overflows and improve our water quality. And I included this map on the right-hand side to really just illustrate and make the point that Philadelphia is located at the very bottom of the quite large Delaware River watershed. And this speaks to the importance of our watershed-wide partnerships and working with committees and groups like the Advisory Committee on Climate Change through the DRBC in all of the work that we do. So switching gears a bit to focus on the work that we're doing in our climate change adaptation program. The focus or mission of our program is to characterize and reduce the risks and expenses that our utility will face from the impacts of climate change by identifying and implementing effective and feasible adaptation strategies. And one of our key adaptation strategies, and what's been really critical and will continue to be really critical to achieving our mission, is mainstreaming the use of climate change projections in our planning, design, operations, and management processes. And our fundamental mechanism for mainstreaming the use of climate science is the document that I'm showing on the right-hand side of this slide. This is our climate resilient planning and design guidance document. And in a nutshell, what it contains are sections that cover all of the major climate change impacts that we are expected to experience in Philadelphia. So we have a tidal trepidation section focused on sea level rise and storm surge impacts, a storm ahead section that analyzes precipitation projections for our city and region, and then a getting heated section, which, as you can probably guess, is our air temperature section, where we look at increasing air temperatures. And there's a lot of information in this guidance document, a lot of different tools that we have developed to make the science actionable for our planners and design engineers, but I've highlighted a few examples at the bottom of this screen. So in the tidal trepidation section, one of the major components of that section is a coastal design flood elevation for all of our infrastructure that's located in either current or future coastal floodplains. And this elevation incorporates sea level rise projections and storm surge. In our precipitation or storm ahead section, we have developed future intensity duration frequency or IDF curves that are based on precipitation projections from a high emissions scenario. And then in our temperature section, we have analyzed localized air temperature projections for various climate scenarios to come up with statistics like increases in average monthly and annual temperature, as well as the increasing frequency of extreme events like heat waves. And instead of really diving into the technical components of this guidance, because I would need a lot more than 10 minutes to do that, I wanted to focus on some of the key takeaways and lessons learned from our development process, because I hope that these are really interesting to all of you in the audience and can maybe inform the work you're doing or how you're thinking about climate change. So one of the major things was that we didn't anticipate how much effort would be required to make the climate science actionable. And I should say we embarked on this whole process to develop the guidance several years ago. So I think that actually the landscape has changed quite a bit since then, and the adaptation field is really rapidly evolving. And new tools and resources are being released regularly. So if we had started this guidance process today, I'm not sure if we would have had the same journey, but when we did start it several years ago, we had to spend significant time and resources on making the climate science actionable for our planning and design applications. And an example of a new tool and resource, just yesterday, I learned that through an effort that was funded by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and EPA, I believe, there was a new tool out that has future precipitation information for the whole country in this intensity, duration, frequency format. So that's just one example of a tool that's become recently available, and it's really exciting to see how the field is just so rapidly evolving and progressing at this point. Along those lines, partnerships and forums for information exchange have been really crucial to us to basically understand what resources are available and to figure out what will be the most useful tools to apply to our work at PWD. And I have a map here on the right-hand side of the slide showing all of the member organizations in the National Water Utility Climate Alliance, which PWD is a part of. It's made up of 12 of the nation's largest water providers. And this group has really been fundamental to moving our work forward at PWD. They have actually recently published a leading practices in climate adaptation report on their website, which I encourage you to check out. This report in leading practices was developed with input from all of the member agencies, including PWD, and many of the lessons learned and takeaways I'm listing on this slide were reflected at other utilities across the country in their efforts to either develop adaptation programs or develop guidance documents similar to ours. So I encourage you to check out WUCA's website. And then another big area that we learned a lot about was uncertainty in projections. And of course, there are many different sources of uncertainty when it comes to dealing with climate change science, and those sources need to be understood. But one of the most useful approaches for us in terms of dealing with the uncertainty was to always think about the context in which we are applying this climate science. One example is that we are, of course, a utility that provides critical services and has critical infrastructure systems. And so because of that, we have an overall low risk tolerance. And that leads us to really focus on projections that are associated with higher emissions scenarios, because we want to understand what a worst case scenario could look like and what it could mean for the operations and the infrastructure at our utility. So that's just one example of how we would think about the context in which we are applying the science to help us make some decisions. It also was really a constant balancing act for us to create flexible and adaptive guidance. It's really, adaptive management is one of the leading or best practices when it comes to climate work. But at the same time with this guidance document, we were trying to balance the flexibility with providing specific enough information that would be useful to our engineers and planners. And one example of that is with the coastal design flood elevation I mentioned. The process to come up with that number was a very lengthy one because we thought a lot about the projections we wanted to focus on, the other factors that would feed into that DFE. But at the end of the day, we felt like our engineers did need a number from us, and they didn't want to be overwhelmed with, a range of different potential scenarios, even though, of course, those should be considered in the planning phase with any of this type of work. And then the last two items on this slide really, I think, reflect learning processes for our team over the past couple of years. One being, don't let perfect be the enemy of progress. This is a challenging one, and I'm speaking as an engineer because it's hard to know there is no quote unquote right answer with all of the uncertainty in the climate projections and the fact that we're trying to make investment decisions today, not knowing exactly how the future is going to look. But instead of getting caught in this paralysis by analysis frame of mind, we had to just keep thinking that, we're using the best available information and making the most informed decisions possible. And our priority is to make sure that the science is being used. And that's really, what we were able to achieve in developing this guidance. And then overall, I would say anyone embarking on developing an adaptation program, a plan, a guidance document, one should be prepared for it to be a longer term, iterative and evolving process. And that is really not necessarily a bad thing because as we're learning, the process is often more important than the plan and the end product. And that leads me to my next slide, which is more focused on our strategies to get buy-in for using this guidance document and then implementing it throughout the department. And we basically used a combination of bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches. And what I mean by bottom-up is that right from the get-go, we really prioritized engaging with staff across our utility. And we actually didn't engage with them on the guidance itself specifically at first. We took some time to go through what we called Climate 101 presentations to make sure, all staff really understood the fundamentals in terms of climate change and what impacts we can expect in Philadelphia. And then over time, we started to engage with them more frequently on topics specific to the guidance to make sure that we would be developing tools that would be as relevant as possible to the work they're doing and easy for them to use. We also simultaneously identified climate champions throughout our utility, and these were staff in different units and programs that we felt we could really lean on to make sure that climate science was actually being used in the work they're doing and would be a contact point for us throughout the whole development process to make sure we're developing the most useful product possible. But ultimately, what was interesting for us is that this whole bottom-up approach, I think, was really successful in terms of getting buy-in for using the guidance. But we did feel at the end of the development process that we actually needed a policy, a department-wide policy to drive change and ensure that the information was being used consistently across the department, and that staff felt really empowered to use the guidance document, and that our team ourselves also feel empowered to continue the implementation process. And so we were successful in having a policy adopted by our executives across the department earlier this year. So that was a really big step forward for us. And now we're really focusing in on, the implementation phase, which is surely going to be iterative like the development process was. But I'm just going to end things by saying the guidance is actually now posted online if you want to check it out and see all of the content that we have in there. I have the link directly to the document on this slide. And then if you just Google PWD Climate Change Adaptation Program, it'll take you to our landing page, and the guidance document is listed in our adaptation resources box on the right-hand side there. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda and Beth and Julia. Very great conversation. And just remind everyone that if you have a question, to please put it into the Q&A box. And we'd love to see some more questions listed there. Beth, I probably have the hardest question for you. I know there's no real answer, especially at this point, but you did talk about DEIJ and what's going on at the Delaware River Basin Commission, and not picking on the commission because as those of us who work in the environmental field all know that generally when you're talking about a large expanse of water like the Delaware River Basin, most of the people that are coming to the meetings and voicing their opinions are people who are not people of color. And becomes very striking, especially for those of us who are driving up from Philadelphia, Camden, Chester, and realizing that that the lower part of the river is 40% people of color. And also the most poverty is really down in that region, and so is the most pollution. And this effort that DRBC is making and many institutions are making now is going to be a long road. But do you have any comments on that and how that changes?
Absolutely. Thanks, Howard. Yes. So this is a major consideration, not only in climate change, but in how we operate overall. The Commission certainly recognizes that DEIJ has to factor into our future work to ensure equitable outcomes. And I think that's why our commissioners have been so supportive to have us undertake this strategic planning process specific to DEIJ, as I had mentioned, we're in the middle of. So we're exploring issues through that process, like enhanced notification, public participation, additional enhancements to what we call our permitting process, our docket process. And I think there's a commitment to see that implemented, when it gets to the end point. And internally as well, it's allowing us to explore topics that are needed and drive change, like vendor contracts, diverse hiring, retention, things like that. I think we're also recognizing that we can learn from partners who are further along in the work, like the Water Center, focusing on urban water issues, for example. We're also participating in the Coalition for the Delaware Watersheds work group on diversity, and bringing back some of those learnings to our staff and for discussion, and also from members of AC3 that have a variety of perspectives and settings that they're working in. I think what's complicated is as a regulator, right? So we can set water quality standards for the main stem Delaware that are adopted by states. As a regulator, there's always that equity issue of affordability, and what do increasing regulation or new regulation mean for the end of the line? What's the customer impact, especially as you mentioned, Howard, the stretch of the river and the sections that are most that have the largest water quality challenges still today are the most urbanized. And so looking at additional investments and additional opportunities to be innovative is, we're just continuing to be open to all ideas.
Thank you. Hey, Julia, I was so taken when when you talked about the culture-wide culture shift throughout the department, because as you may remember, that we were involved with that change to put in Green Cities, Clean Waters, and basically culture shift happened one person at a time, one agency at a time, and glad you're still there working on those issues. Any other ideas of how you make that culture shift happen and lessons learned from making that move in that direction?
Yeah, great question, Howard. And I should have mentioned maybe the program started when Howard was commissioner at Philadelphia water. So it's really exciting, to be at a point where we have this deliverable, the guidance, and we feel like it's, really, it's going to be fundamental to helping us further that culture shift. I think that, I feel like the culture shift actually happened pretty organically in the development phase for this document, because we prioritize staff engagement and building their capacity on the topic, and really hearing them when, they would tell us like, well, if you develop that specific product, there's no way we're going to use that or incorporate, like that's too complicated, or that's not going to be, immediately applicable. So I think just that whole engagement and back and forth created a pretty organic shift, where now it's kind of expected that climate is considered in, all our major projects in our programs, like our long-term water master planning program and wastewater master planning program. And we're also thinking more about what this means for our green infrastructure program as well. So I think, it was a process, that I think just really hinged on that staff engagement. The challenge ahead is going to be carrying that culture shift forward into the implementation phase, because we're finding that how you apply this science, even with having this like baseline guidance document, really is dependent on the application, whether it be a specific project, a specific program, or a process like the capital planning process. So we have to kind of go through a lot more implementation-based discussions with staff, but I do look forward to that. And I know I'm confident in the fact that we have a strong foundation with kind of the culture shift that's already occurred.
Great, thank you. Hey, Amanda. So sorry, I'll try to keep it a little easier on you here. I guess the next question really comes from a lot of what Julia was saying about top down, bottom up, and how does that all work within an institution. And I'm just curious whether the National Park Service uses a similar technique, or were you working in a different direction?
Thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting to see Julia's summary of how that worked for them, because I think we are definitely a combination of top down and bottom up. I think for us, we maybe on climate started with some of that high level top down guidance, where in 2010 we had an NPS climate change response strategy, and it's following from that some policy guidance that really enabled the bottom up efforts from the parks to start going in a lot of different directions. And now we're at the stage where we're trying to pull together those things to come up with, some of those guidance documents, so that we can share those best practices and have more of the top down to reach broader from those initial, innovators at the bottom.
Great, thank you. Question from the audience that is to you, Beth. It's Beth, if I wanted to introduce the governance model you're using at DRBC to my local policymakers, where would I go to develop a deeper understanding of the legislative framework in place?
Sure, that's a great question. Our website.
There's last piece to it is, and how do you make lightning? How do you make lightning strike twice at the same place? Go ahead.
That question I can't answer about lightning, but certainly it is a unique governance model, and I love to nerd out about it. But if you're interested in learning more, we do have a pretty robust history on the DRBC website that describes how the compact essentially has concurrent legislation in each of the 4 basin states plus federal law, and so it's pretty cool and definitely worth worth a look. I think it's proved to be a durable model.
Great, thank you. Yes, it has. 60 years is pretty good, pretty good. The last question that we have for our hour today goes to Julia, and the question is what coordination with other entities within the city was required in developing the climate resilient planning and design guidance? Does any of the guidance conflict with information from the mayor's OOS? I've been away too long. I don't know what OOS is.
Office of Sustainability. Yeah.
Oh,
no longer the mayor's office. It's permanent. Yeah, which is great. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it conflicts with any of that information. Several years ago, when we started the effort, we did review all of the reports that Office of Sustainability had released on the climate topic. They had a comprehensive report on projections that they had analyzed for the city of Philadelphia. I'd say what we did was we built off of that, and we, because the science is so rapidly evolving, we're actually using some new sources of projections now from when some of the sustainability source reports were released. But we had different needs as a water utility in terms of the format of, the information the projections were presented in and the resolution and all of that. So we really just build off of existing citywide resources to create products that would inform infrastructure design. And we continue to have, regular dialogue with Office of Sustainability and other city partners through forums like the Citywide Flood Risk Management Task Force to keep them up to date on the work that we are producing at PWD and see if it can help inform anything. There's a lot of resilience planning work happening citywide, so seeing if our guidance can help inform any of that, or if we can, learn from what other agencies are doing. So it is an ongoing dialogue and an evolving one and iterative, like I mentioned in all the lessons learned. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Julia. And we did just get one more question in from the audience, and it's for all the panelists. I guess it's a good way to end the session. Can the panelists comment, and I'll add briefly comment on nature-based solutions that are being promoted in the region, what the public acceptance of these are, and how are these solutions being financed? That's an easy one for Julia, so I'll let Amanda.
Well, as you know, I touched very briefly on our Green Stormwater Infrastructure Program, and the driver of that program is to reduce combined sewer overflows. We're starting to have more conversations with that group on using nature-based solutions to help deal with some of the more extreme rainfall that we're seeing in the city. And this is really just not a PWD conversation. This is a citywide conversation. And thinking about what is often termed blue-green infrastructure and how that can be used to help reduce flooding risks, actually, and that being a primary driver of some innovative nature-based solutions. And, we can look to other cities that have already started piloting work like that. New York has what they call a cloudburst management pilot. Copenhagen has a whole citywide cloudburst management plan, which is all around this idea of blue-green / nature-based solutions being able to help us deal with the risk posed by extreme rainfall. So
great,
what we're thinking about with that now.
Yeah, I love the cloudburst technologies. It's starting with what if you allowed an inch of rain or 2 inches of rain to build up on the roadways during a cloudburst, and that's a lot of storage you can get that's just temporary and is already there and doesn't cost very much. But people would have to be willing to get their feet wet. Beth?
Yeah, I can go next. So in terms of on the ground implementation, DRBC doesn't do a lot, but I'll just highlight one small thing we're doing that's sort of incorporating nature-based solutions, or at least pointing in that direction, and that's a decision support tool for aquatic habitat. This is focused in the upper basin. It's primarily looking at flow, but it's also including temperature to address adaptation planning for temperature sensitive species. And helping provide that information will prioritize conservation efforts and maybe direct where like tree planting, shading might be most impactful for habitat. And then briefly, I'll just plug the FEMA BRIC program does have a very strong emphasis on nature-based solutions. So folks can check that program out. And certainly I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Delaware River Basin Restoration Program. That's a Fish and Wildlife grant program, and that has a certain category within the grant program for green infrastructure.
Thank you, Beth. And Amanda, it sounds like I guess you have the last word. And if you say anything other than the importance of nature-based solutions at the National Park Service, I'll be very disappointed.
Well, I think there's a lot of support for them. We're very interested. We're at the stages where we're still, right, there's a lot to be learned in terms of, design and monitoring to make sure that they're doing what they need. And especially with that question about funding, is that we have to be creative in terms of getting to implementation, and where we're seeing that is not our standard systems are set up for that yet, but hopefully we have these, examples where we show that they can be successful, that we'll get the guidance to make it easier through our standard funding to do that more in the future.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for putting this, for being here with us on this, and also to the people behind the scenes here. It's Crystal Pleasant and Emma Dennison from the Water Center who've made all this really possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you for attending and for staying. I realize we stayed 5 minutes late, and so I appreciate how many of you were able to stay to the very end. It was a really great dialogue, and I personally really enjoyed it. There's a lot more to be done, and I look forward to listening and hearing about progress that's being made by these three entities, as well as everyone else in the rest of the world, and wondering like what's going to happen. I mean, just the mitigation piece is just like seems to be falling apart day by day, as we look at and see what's going on around the world, and the issue of fossil fuels in Ukraine and Russia, and the impact that's going to have or not have on how we change our ways into the future. Again, this program has been recorded and will be available on the Water Center's website starting tomorrow, and we would love to get your feedback via email. Please take a few moments to fill it out so that we can learn how to improve our future program. Again, thank you everyone for a terrific program. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Not too hot, not too cold, beautiful. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.